On the Radar with the CBS 17 Storm Team.
Welcome to On the Radar. I'm meteorologist Ross Whitley, and welcome back, Wes Hohenstein, chief meteorologist. Hasn't been on for the last couple of weeks. We had the Friends reunion episode between Ross and Rachel, and now it's Wes and Ross.
No, there's not a lot of Wes's out there on 90s sitcoms. But yeah, with calm weather, nothing in the tropics, and no storms around here. I had a couple days off, did a little traveling, and now played a little golf. And I timed it just right because I am back, and boy, are things getting busy on land and over the ocean with the tropics heating up and finally some much-needed rain coming to North Carolina. But we've got a lot to talk about in today's episode.
Yes, we do, and we're going to start right off with the current tropics. We now have Umberto out there, and yes, that is how you say it, Umberto.
Not Humberto.
Not Humberto. I am back into my North Carolina roots here, and I'm getting reused to North Carolinians. It's been 11 years since I've lived in the state. I grew up here, so I am one of you, or as they would say, one of us.
One of y'all?
That's even better. One of y'all. But I have heard holler and hollow said every which way you can possibly say it since coming back. But yeah, we have Tropical Storm Umberto. We are saying goodbye to Gabrielle, or social media likes to call it Gabby. I don't know where that came from. Maybe you can enlighten me on that one.
Nickname, no idea, but it's a lot easier than Gabrielle.
I guess.
But first time this year we've had two named storms at the same time.
Yes, it is. And we also have an 80% chance of formation. And by the time you're watching this, that might be Imelda. So Wes, talk us through what's going on right now.
So as strange as it sounds, that's the one we're most worried about. And worried not that it's going to come directly for North Carolina, but worried because that's the one that has a chance of getting closer to the East Coast. Gabrielle obviously moving away. Umberto, all signs are pointing that to be a Bermuda problem. But based on what's set up over the southeast United States, based on what's set up over the Atlantic, like is always set up, a big ridge of high pressure, the future Imelda has the best chance of getting close to the East Coast and possibly having an impact. Umberto, there you can see the forecast track, could be a Cat 2 early next week near Bermuda. And remember, those forecast tracks from the National Hurricane Center, they're not arrows. It's not a giant arrow that if you keep going out, it's going to head right for North Carolina. That's what's happening in the next 5 days. Day 6, 7, and 8, that thing is most likely going to curve around that high pressure over the Atlantic and not really be our problem. But it is part of a very complicated, uncertain forecast based on everything that's going on out there. So the 94L, which is what it's called right now, future Imelda, is probably the fourth thing in the pecking order of what we need to figure out before we know what Imelda's going to do. And it has to do with the high. It has to do with that big low over the southeast United States. It has to do with what's going to happen with that front, kind of. But also, what's Umberto going to do? Is Umberto going to flex its muscle and kind of strong arm Imelda? I mean, there's a lot going on. I know we always say this is complicated and we've got to wait and see. We really got to wait and see what's going to happen with this one.
Yeah, typically you always want to wait until an area of center has formed. And we say low pressure system. What we mean, we're talking about an area of literal lower pressure. So lower heights in the atmosphere, that means things are rising. And we get that instability. Eventually, we get a column to form. And once we have a closed low-level surface, that's when we have a center. And that is something we can actually track. That's something we can actually forecast. The models usually get a much better idea of what is going to happen once we actually have a low-pressure system center out there in the Atlantic.
And when we're recording this episode of On the Radar, it is Wednesday, and that was the first time the Hurricane Hunter aircraft went out to investigate. So we're just now starting to get good data. And I forgot to mention, how about all those mountainous islands down in the Caribbean? They're going to have an impact on if and when Imelda forms and where it forms. So there's still a lot to be decided in the next 72 hours.
Yeah, most likely scenario here is that Umberto takes and flexes its muscles across the Atlantic. It probably shears what will be Imelda, which is 94L at the moment, and likely pushes it toward Cuba or leaves it in the Bahamas, grabs it and pulls it out to sea. The other scenario that could play out here is if 94L does find some footing and is able to develop, it could work out of the Bahamas, be influenced by that upper level low, and then work toward that boundary you see there represented as a stationary front. If the upper low ends up having more influence than Umberto, then this potentially becomes an issue for the Carolinas, either in rainfall because we're seeing moisture overriding that frontal boundary for days on end, or it could even bring tropical impacts. That is a lower risk scenario at the moment. It's more likely that Umberto grabs this and pulls it out, because typically you just don't have two areas of low pressure this close together without them influencing each other.
Right. And let's also be clear that whatever happens with Imelda is separate than the good rain chances that big area of low pressure, that troughiness on the East Coast is going to happen. That's happening no matter what. Could just be some extra moisture if Imelda gets a little closer to the East Coast.
Yeah, so hopefully you're watching this and this is Sunday or Monday for you, and what we just described happened exactly the way we described it, and we look fantastic. So hopefully that's the way things are playing out. But looking back on this season, especially for this time of year, we typically see activity peak a couple of weeks ago, and then we see higher amounts of activity last until about the 20th of October. And so far this season, it really just hasn't been much going on. So going back to what Wes was saying earlier, this is the first time we've had two named systems in the Atlantic at once. And that is just crazy thinking back on the preseason numbers where we were saying this could be an above average season. Now, there were no hyperactive predictions out there, but there certainly were definitely an above average consensus across all the forecasting track. And we may still get there. It's still possible.
Yeah, and remember, this is all after a stretch of a couple weeks where we didn't have any named storms. I mean, after Aaron and Fernan, I mean, it was a while before Gabby came along. A very unusual dead period during the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season.
Yeah, and this is the time of year that we typically start to go, oh boy, because the F through I is the most retired names on the list. They're the ones that usually get replaced because this is the time of year that you're talking about the big bad boys out there, the Cat 2 or 2s, 3s, 4s,
Right.
And unfortunately, this is also the time of year when Cat 5s happen.
Yep, and you talked about it on the last episode. This is about the time of year where the storms that have been a historic imprint on many of our brains over the years, Floyd and Fran and Florence and Francis and Fred and Ivan, and now we're coming up on the year anniversary of the H-name storm that will forever live in our brains, Helene, 1 year ago this week.
Yeah, 1 year ago this week, and there is a great look at the satellite picture just before landfall. And if you remember back, just before landfall, this was yet again another case of a rapidly intensifying storm as it was approaching land. And in my experience, my relatively short experience, I've been doing this for about 10 years now, that anytime you're getting an intensifying hurricane to come ashore, that's usually never a good sign. A, in the fact that you're talking about a stronger system, but B, you usually see those systems make more of an impact inland because they kind of hold together a little bit longer than the storms that are weakening as they're coming ashore. In most cases, if you're already on the downtrend, you're not talking about a storm that is going to be remembered in historic fashion, unless it's something like Katrina. Katrina came ashore as a weakening system. But all the ones in my recent memory that were intensifying as coming ashore are all storms that we remember. Charlie, Harvey, going back to Milton just last year, Helene last year, Hurricane Michael, which I have experience with. All of those systems were strengthening systems. I think even going back to before I was born, predating myself, Hurricane Hugo, that was rapidly intensifying as it was coming ashore too as well. It made landfall as a Category 4, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, back in it was Hugo the 50s or 60s, but yes. For the second time, yes, you have pointed out that you are younger than me. We get it. But listen, I mean, think about this. Helene came together from nothing to a Cat 4 and the devastation in the western part of the state in about 5 days. It went from a disorganized cloud storm in the western Caribbean to what you see there in about 4 days, and then up the southeast United States in another day and a half. And rapid intensification, it's so incredibly hard to predict, and it burned Florida and the southeast United States a year ago.
Yeah, the stat that will forever be in my mind, thanks to the many hurricane conferences I have attended, is that all landfalling Cat 5 hurricanes in the United States were tropical storms 3 days prior to landfall.
Wow.
3 days, all of them. So you're going Labor Day, Camille, Michael, Andrew. All were tropical storms 3 days prior to landfall. So sometimes the best information we can give you is that you're going to get 3 days to prepare. That doesn't necessarily mean that 3 days the messaging is going to be a major hurricane is going to make landfall. It may be we've got a hurricane coming. Prepare, as this could rapidly intensify, especially when we know the ingredients are there for systems to rapidly intensify. So I always try to measure that home and hammer it home is that you get 3 days. We may see a system come from the main development region, and we might get 14, 15 days. But for the most part, you get 3 days of knowing a system is coming to your location.
Yeah, and let's talk about what Helene produced. Again, it was a Category 4 when it made landfall in Florida. And, you know, North Carolinians have a totally different recollection of this storm than Floridians. It did totally different stuff. But it was a Cat 4 with 140-mile-an-hour winds. It brought more than 7 feet of storm surge to Tampa, Florida. And what was the number on the panhandle of the storm surge?
We had storm surge upwards of 20 feet into the bend.
Yeah.
So in my area, we were on the western side of this storm when it made landfall in the bend near Perry, Florida, which... Funny fact there, that county had never had a landfalling system. Over the last 3 years, they've now had 3 landfalling systems in that county. 2 were very close to Perry, Florida itself. So goes to show you that sometimes the numbers are not your friend. When you say, oh, well, we're due, or, oh, we just had one, we're not going to see one again. Sometimes you do. Sometimes it's the next year, and Perry, Florida can attest to that. But, I remember thinking about this storm completely differently than any North Carolinian did because we were concerned about the storm surge. And Tampa, that's just a crazy stat to me because Tampa was nowhere close to the center of this storm. And that is a modern-day record. So you have to go back to the hurricane of 1927 to see any storm surge higher than that in Tampa Bay, and Tampa recorded 7.2 feet of storm surge. In fact, just like North Carolinians are now, a year later, there's plenty of storefronts in areas that dealt with inundation that produced 4 or 5 feet of sand into areas where this storm surge was. So that was thanks to a lot of the things that brought this setup and made this storm so catastrophist, if that's even a word, made this storm so bad. Is that you had multiple things working for it that unfortunately all produced wind in one direction for Tampa that just built that water and just kept building that water. And then you saw Hurricane Helene come through and it just threw the water and sand inland. So completely different from what North Carolinians, what South Carolinians, and even what Georgia did. I think going back and thinking about Helene here, you really forget. A lot of people in Georgia will probably, say amen to this. You really forget that this was still a hurricane basically all the way up into South Carolina. So through Athens, Georgia, and places in western Georgia, they had Category 2, Category 3 type winds work right over the top of them as this storm was rapidly moving inland and eventually was even still a tropical storm when it worked through western North Carolina, which is crazy thinking that it traveled hundreds of miles from the bend of Florida.
So while Florida was having problems with storm surge and the water coming up from the ocean, North Carolina had too much rain coming down from the sky, more than 30 inches in some parts, resulting in 63 rivers and streams hitting all-time record levels at different points. The USGA had nearly 2,000 landslides. We had wind that was knocking down trees that had loosened up soil from not just Helene, but the predecessor rain event. And much like Floyd did back in the 90s, shortly after Tropical Storm Dennis hit, it was a 1-2 punch that caused most of the problems. We were going to have problems with Helene just by itself, but the fact that we had in the week before a big rain event that kind of soaked everything, which made it really easy to leave Helene with the disastrous results that we're now talking about a year later.
Yeah, and if you dump all of that rain into one area, especially over steep terrain, you end up with disaster. And we have a look from Bat Cave, North Carolina, which is just off to the south of Asheville, of exactly up close and personal what that looked like.
Blake Smith was at his home in Bat Cave, North Carolina, when Helene invited herself into the heart of Appalachia and tried to tear it apart. Blake watched helplessly as his neighbors' homes crumbled and then his own.
People just never understand it unless they saw it themselves.
Blake and his neighbors were trapped for 3 days until they decided to hike their way out amid power lines, mud, and debris, however they could.
Don't look down, look straight.
They made it out safely, but this was the damage that Blake left behind. His home looked like a wrecking ball had crashed through it. A year later, we met where his cabin once stood.
The water came up about 24, 25 feet here.
Looking down from the now cleared land, he remembers the snakes.
I looked down and there was snakes all in the grass around me.
The snakes were trying to survive like Blake, who was forced outside with his dog to watch for an inevitable mudslide.
The world had gotten so small that the likelihood of surviving it was getting pretty grim, for sure. Yeah.
All of the rain and the force of the storm pushed mud and trees like this one down the mountain, and it had one place to flow, right toward the river and through Blake's house.
The carnage might not have physically injured Blake and his neighbors, but it hurt them all the same.
Time's gone by, it's changed my life completely.
He's battled a series of disaster relief hurdles and is now focusing on the future.
Help orient me where the new house will be.
Yeah, well, this was the existing front of the house.
Okay.
This will now become about the middle section.
Blake is building back smaller amid the high cost of construction and labor.
So we'll just make the most of what we can do.
Precision grading and disaster relief has been toiling away at restructuring the riverbanks.
Every day, 7 days a week.
They've moved tons of debris, cleared slabs, and helped in recovery.
In the beginning, helped retrieve what the cadaver dogs were finding.
Those moments change a person. Jake Jarvis and his crew have been forever changed.
When you come into an area like this, especially a year ago, it was, it was hard to go a day without crying.
Precision grading isn't charging people. They rely on donations to help people like Blake.
There was no way that I could put a price on what they lost.
His crew, the neighbors, and Blake all know each other by first names now. There's a special kind of community in Bat Cave, and it's stronger than ever.
You're now family, you're gonna get through this together, and when it's all said and done, you may go back to your lives rebuilt, but you're forever kind of bonded, and that's a kind of a beautiful thing.
In Bat Cave.
Yeah, a year later and still recovering. Something I can attest to, and anyone that's gone through any kind of disaster, that time changes how things are approached when you think back about a storm, but you certainly never forget that feeling of going through that disaster, and the remnants and what you see out there is forever changed and imprinted in your mind, because you're always able to look at a certain spot and go, wow, this looked like that.
I remember, yeah. Yeah, and we've had a year to look back and collect all this great information. And NOAA had a great write-up. NOAA, the science-based part of our government, and they just did a really good job summarizing and giving us statistics and perspective. So between Helene and the predecessor rain event for all the southeast United States, from about a 5 or 6 day period from September 24th to 28th. From the Florida Panhandle all the way up through the Appalachian Mountains, there were 42 trillion gallons of water dumped in that area during that time, which is equivalent to what Niagara Falls spits out in almost 2 years. So Niagara Falls for 2 years over the southeast United States, that's what happened, and that's why it's such a disaster.
And when we come back, we're going to be talking about the setup of Helene, what inevitably happened, and we'll even look at some of the photos during the event, just after the event. We'll assess that right after this.
On the radar with the CBS 17 Storm Team.
And welcome back to On the Radar. And when we left you last, we were talking about the setup of Hurricane Helene. We are just about a year later from the storm, and we were looking at this graphic where we had landfall in Perry, Florida. We had talked about the number of landslides, which is just mind-blowing, nearly 2,063 streams and gauges hit record levels. And that was mostly in western North Carolina. So how did we get there?
Well, like happened in 1999 when Hurricane Floyd came along. Floyd was nothing without Tropical Storm Dennis, which hit a few weeks before. And while the predecessor rain event before Hurricane Helene didn't have a name, it caused a lot of problem. And here's what happened. A few days before Hurricane Helene made landfall, there was an area of low pressure at several levels of the atmosphere. And what is a low pressure? It is an unsettled area in the atmosphere. And it has a counterclockwise circulation around that low pressure. And that counterclockwise circulation was pulling in all kinds of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. And we get low pressures all the time. Sometimes they're hurricanes in the summer, sometimes they're nor'easters in the winter, but they bring unsettled weather. With that and a ton of moisture setting up over an area in the southeast United States that has mountains and upslopes that create even more lift, and you got a lot of rain already in the soil, and then here comes Hurricane Helene. The leftovers didn't matter. There was still a lot of moisture to be had, and it was the combination of that 1-2 punch that resulted in the disaster that we're left talking about today. It was the 7th costliest disaster from the tropics in United States history, and it had not been that bad since Hurricane Katrina, Ross, in 2005.
Yeah, this was the deadliest storm since Katrina. Unfortunately, 250 plus fatalities. As of recording this, their attributed number is 252. Mm-hmm. I know that there are still several that are classified as missing. And we're a year later. So you can kind of do the additional math on that. And I think there was over 170 noted injuries also contributed to Helene. So talking about people that didn't have a fatal accident with Helene, but were significantly injured enough to be documented in the storm and the post-storm analysis. It was also one of the top 10 costliest tropical systems in U.S. history.
And the statements that were issued by the National Weather Service before all of this rain fell and before all of the wind knocked down so many forests in the western part of the state, the National Weather Service in Greenville, Spartanburg, a couple days before, issued this statement. Catastrophic flooding and landslides for the mountains and foothills from Hurricane Helene. This will be one of the most significant weather events to happen in western portions of the area in the modern era. So we knew it was going to be bad. The National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center did such a great job in the forecast and then the messaging, but when you have this big of an impact, it's hard to prevent the disaster that we're now seeing.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to something we talked about on last week's episode of On the Radar, is that everyone has a storm of record, and that's something in their brain that they compare storms to. Now, I am the first to tell you that's a bad idea. Don't compare any storm to a previous storm. Every storm is different. But in this area, it's Fran, it's Floyd, it's Francis, back to 2018. Just a little further off to the west, you've got Hurricane Hugo. In western North Carolina, the flood that would have been closest to this happened in 1916. So that is over 100 years prior to the flood that happened here. So no one was alive during this event that was alive during that event that they could have compared this to. So when you're signaling, we're going to be talking about record crests. And if you look at the Swannanoa River as well as the French Broad, you beat the record crest by over a foot. And that's crazy, especially when you think about what happened in western North Carolina and what over a foot means with those rivers and streams.
Yeah, and some of these places got, in a 4-day period, 5.5 months worth of rain in 4 days. So you put that on a flat surface, that's a lot of rain. You put it on sloping surfaces where all that water is going to collect in valleys where you've already had a bunch of rain, bring the levels of rivers and streams and lakes up. There is no way to avoid a disaster. We talked about how much rain and perspective, and we talked about all the records that were set in rivers and streams. There were 34 flash flood emergencies issued by the National Weather Service in Greenville, Spartanburg alone. Then you pile on the wind. And we know that sometimes at the top of mountains it's a little windier than it is at sea level. They had 100-mile-per-hour wind gusts. There was a weather station in western North Carolina that had a max wind gust of 106 miles per hour. So you put all that rain into tree roots, you're going to loosen up those trees, and they're going to come down a lot easier. And that's why the North Carolina Forest Service estimated that more than 800,000 acres of timberlands in the state were damaged. 800,000 acres.
That's a ton. And when all of that is happening over certain areas where we were just highlighting with topography, you drain all of that water down and it inevitably ends up in a stream or a creek, which is how we ended up at those record crests. That 30.7 was about 10 miles to the east of the highest point of the east of the Mississippi, also known as Mount Mitchell. And that's what you see on the map. Where a lot of that water ended up draining to was the French Broad as well as Broad Branch, which is directly located on US 74 or North Carolina 9. In Chimney Rock, they refer to that road as Main Street, and you can see what looks like a creek there from the aerial view. That was actually where the road was paralleled along it, and when you flood it that bad, this is the end result. Is you see on the left what it looked like before Helene, what it looked like just about a day or two after Helene on the right. And that mountain peak you see on the left there, that is Chimney Rock. That is where the state park is located. So you can see exactly what we had labeled on the other map, what it looked like from the ground.
Right. So many times in history, it is easier to build a road in the mountains next to a body of water, a river or a stream, partially because, hundreds of years ago, we needed to be close to a source of water, but also throughout time, it's easier to cut into a mountain and to not go through a mountain, but instead have a road go along a river. But unfortunately, when you have a disaster come along where rivers and streams and lakes are flooded near the road, near stores, and near homes, it's all kind of in the same place, and it compounds the problem. And you can see many neighborhoods and businesses, main streets, were turned into lakes and rivers. And, water's not light. When's the last time you went to get a gallon of milk from your refrigerator for cereal in the morning? I mean, a gallon of milk is heavy. And how much did we say? We had trillions of gallons of water flowing down a mountainside. And that's why we have all the damage we do.
Yeah, so it's a year later from Hurricane Helene. I don't want to end it on a sour note, but we're running out of time here, Wes. So I know you like to do this every week. Let's get to it. You're going to have to go through these really quickly.
Yep. So every night at 11 o'clock on CBS 17 News, we ask you to send us your super sunset or sunrise shots. So we had a lot of summer vacations, and Brian was one of those vacationers up in Wisconsin, this super sunset. I don't think that's his sailboat, but that was a super sunset. We'll go even farther north from Wisconsin to Alaska. This is North Pole, Alaska. Susan was up there over the summer, and that sunset was at 11 o'clock at night. Let's come back to North Carolina, where Michael was in Surf City. He was up early for a super sunrise. That's a beautiful shot there on the beach. Up to Hyco Lake in Person County, Karen has a super sunset. You know how I feel about water sunsets. You get the reflection. It's 2 for the price of 1. Beautiful shot there. And we'll finish down in Daytona Beach, Florida. Paul was up early for a super sunrise. And again, if you've got anything in your camera roll, drop me an email to sendit@cbs17.com. I show your pictures every night at 11 o'clock on CBS 17.
And that's going to do it for this week on the Radar. A look back at Hurricane Helene.